really what comply with the act. And yeah, looking forward to the discussion today.
Hey, hi. Good evening, everyone. I think pleasure to be here. My name is Vijay Rajagopal. I head go-to-market for AWS's BFSI and fintech practice. Essentially work with our customers across a whole host of banks, NBFCs, capital market firms, and insurers, along with a lot of our partners, right, to see how we can best address some of their customer challenges. One of the key things that we have of course been seeing is has been on the data and the privacy related aspects, which of course we will cover in detail today. A little bit in terms of my background, I've spent more than 20 years in the financial services industry. Prior to my current role, I was heading the merchant payments business at Amazon Pay, and before that, I was the head of the cross-border business at PayPal in India. Looking forward to this discussion today.
Thank you. And as you can see, we've got together colleagues from, of course, the policy perspective, from a legal and sort of policy perspective, as well as Vijay, who obviously looks and works with organizations to help them do at scale transformations, right? So hopefully, I mean, that's the idea, to get diverse perspectives. So I think with that, why don't we drive straight in? And I think goes without saying, please keep your questions coming. We'll either pick them up along the way, or we've got time at the end. The idea is to keep this interactive and useful to all of you. So with that, why don't I get us started, right? We're going to, like I said, trying to do this in three parts. One, understand what these guidelines are. I think the second is think about what's the full set of capabilities needed to not just comply, right, but to extract value in some sense of data privacy and governance transformation. And where does, in that scheme of things, where do these guidelines fit in? And I think the third part is around, how do you think about doing this in a practical manner? So let's perhaps get going. And Sreenidhi, I'm going to start with you. You, of course, track this space, I guess, much before any of us. There probably is, between you and Prasad, it will be a close call. But you've been very closely involved, not just with the act and the rules, but also in the ecosystem. So I think maybe just for all of us here, could you unpack to us what these guidelines are, right? Is it a compliance checklist? Is it a product blueprint? Is it a signal about upcoming rules? I guess that's the question on most people's minds. So what exactly is this?
Sure. Thanks for that, Malcolm. Yeah, so just maybe to set some context, this document was released by the National E-Governance Division at MeitY as part of a code for consent challenge, a part of a series of DPDP innovation challenges. And the idea was to invite companies, startups, others to develop a consent management solution, which can be integrated into existing systems as principles as well. So strictly speaking, it's not part of the act. It's not part of the rules itself. It's not statute, not regulatory diktat. But yes, it definitely does signal some level of intent. It can serve as a guidance document for how consent can be operationalized. So the document sets out the journey of, through the entire consent lifecycle. It sets out at the beginning how one would collect consent, and it speaks about granular purposes. It talks about what actions one would qualify as affirmative consent. How do you present the notice? How do you create a consent artifact? Maintaining logs. Then it speaks about validating that consent, updating it, renewing it, withdrawing it. So the law really sets out the legal principles, and this document is sort of an indicator of what that legal principle might look like in product. The law might simply say take consent, but the document identifies how that might be done and also gives some insight. Let's say it says when you're logging consent, look at maintain a record with the user ID, timestamp, purpose ID, consent status. So it's a way to operationalize it. But at the same time, of course, this is not strict letter of the law either. The law is still very much the DPDP Act and the rules that will come out, which are principle based. So each business will have to look at what that principle means for them and then apply that to the product. But this can serve as one reference document for what that might look like. I'll pause here.
No, thank you, Sreenidhi, for clarifying that, because I think obviously this has gone around in all these circles, I'm sure, and I'm sure you have, and we have received a lot of questions, and I'm sure everyone has on what this is and what this is not. So thank you for clarifying that. And Prasad, maybe I'll and in your response, I think would love for you to get your perspective on what I asked Sreenidhi, but I'll also add a little bit more in the sense that you've again also looked at these guidelines, and obviously you've got a front row seat in some ways, given your role at DSCI and trained hundreds of BPOs themselves, right, across sectors and forums and all of that. So again, very similarly, is this a sign a regulatory signal? Is it sort of a baseline playbook, as Sreenidhi was alluding to, or actually this is, in some sense, the a signal of a broader privacy infrastructure and tooling that enterprises might need to build, right? And this is probably a sliver of it. So again, would love to get your thoughts, and feel free to also comment on what Sreenidhi laid out.
Yeah, I think it is in a way. See, what has happened is during this process when we're deliberating about grounds of processing, already there is a deviation from what the global norm is in terms of consent is a major instrument or major way of processing the data, and there is certain legitimate usage, which is largely states and its instrumentalities, and obviously employee related, employment related aspects. But if you look at then consent become probably one of the major instrument, and then you have to ensure that there has to be a solution. How do you take consent? And there are obviously licensed products available in the market, but how can we adopt those? How can we probably build a platform where even SMEs can leverage it, startups can leverage it, everyone. So I think from that perspective, I do see this is a significant move, coming up with consent management requirements, and coming up with a kind of a template or framework. What should be the consent management functions, features, how should it be, consent should be processed, because consent obtaining is easy, but the way we have defined consent in our law is also free, unambiguous, clear affirmative action. So that is to meet those obligations, and you need to how these requirements will come in picture, and how do these requirements of the obligations of the or the expectations of the law. So that way I think it's a big move. And look at our country, unlike other laws in other countries, we have a disparity in digital literacy. So we needed a homogeneous infrastructure which will say that so many languages, you have to have translations, you have to give that notice in so many languages. So you should look into these aspects, and from that perspective, multi-language support, granular consent mechanisms, affirmative user actions, all tailored to India's diverse user base. That is something I think is very important, and that is coming through this business requirement document.
No, thank you, Prasad, for sharing your views on that as well. I think my takeaway, at least, is that this leaves a little bit of a marker of the tooling and the capabilities required, in some sense, of
Right.
any sort of, whatever, for lack of better, we call it, technology platform, automation. You can give it any label you want, that would be required for organizations to comply. Right now, we'll get into a discussion of, is this enough? Is there a lot more later? But I guess that's my takeaway from what Sreenidhi, you and Prasad laid out. And I guess it's also a signal to say, hey, it's time to start getting ready. I guess it's a soft signal, perhaps, right, in the way we look at it. And therefore, maybe the question to you, Vijay, now is, I know, obviously, as in the AWS, you work with multiple, large and, in some sense, medium-sized enterprises, right? So what are you hearing in terms of, and of course, with a lot of them, you not just do applications, but you host data and you host several things on AWS infrastructure and solutions. So what are you seeing and hearing in terms of how people are reacting to this? And then, more importantly, what are they doing about getting ready or preparing, in that sense, for compliance, right? And from the BFSI, FSI space, it would be good to sort of hear a little bit about that.
Sure, Malcolm. I think the first thing is that I really think that the BRD signals a pretty serious intent, right? I think while the document is non-binding, at least what it does is that it sets a prescriptive architecture, right, which just goes beyond guidance, right? Like, so it's actually urging enterprises to see this as a roadmap rather than a framework. So to that extent, I think the BRD is actually a welcome development in my mind. What have our customers been doing? I think they have started deploying consent management mechanisms, right? I mean, and that we've started because of the whole account aggregator requirements. So this BRD is, I think it goes granular in terms of consent and multilingual mandates and all of those specs. I think it goes more granular. And if I were to kind of think of what are some of our customers saying, I think to a lot of them, I think they understand the importance of this. It's more like, yes, compliance is inevitable. We need more clarity, right? I think that's one common thing that we keep hearing, saying that, right, like, we will accelerate it once the final notification comes through, right? So people understand the importance of this. I think the other thing, like I mentioned, is I think there is a aggregator framework, account aggregator framework on top of which banks are building. Already, of course, they comply with the master direction on IT governance, and then this is kind of on top of it. So they, some of them actually see it as converging paths, saying that we build consent infra for account aggregation, now we will scale it. Right, like I think one of our large NBFCs, the chief risk officer told us that, saying that in a casual conversation, saying that we will scale it. Right, when the time comes, people are not underestimating the challenge of this, because revocability especially, right, can be quite operationally challenging. Like, if you were to think about it, let's say in a customer journey, in an app, like if there are 15 times let's say interventions happen in terms of asking consent, then you can imagine the customer experience, right? Like, so people appreciate the challenges of this, but I think net I think it's understood that it's here to stay. Right, that's really the sum and substance of what we have been hearing.
Great. That's very heartening to hear, Vijay. And I think, like you said, multiple people are probably already beginning or begun this journey. So that's great. I think with that setup, I think let's maybe change track a little bit now, right? And maybe I'll go back to you, Prasad. And I know you sort of alluded to it when you responded earlier, but this guidelines or BRD or whatever you call it, right? They are is very heavy, or rather not heavy. I think it largely focuses on the consent life cycle itself, right? Which is how do you take it, how do you store it, how does the people access it, logs, all of that. But if I may, for a data fiduciary or a significant data fiduciary to fully comply, not just comply, right? I'm kind of raising the bar. I'm saying if you want to get value out of a real privacy and data governance transformation, what do you think is the full universe of the tooling and technologies that might be needed, right? And in that context, is what is laid out in these guidelines, in your opinion, a small portion, a meaningful portion, or is there actually a lot more to really truly not just comply but gain value from a privacy transformation? You're on mute, Prasad.
Overall, it's a very comprehensive document, I must say that. It beautifully captures what are the expectations of the laws. And some of the things like, specific features like immutable audit trail. There's something very interesting. Now, in my opinion, while there are two things. One, you can have your own consent manager, or you can use the consent manager platform, which is being proposed suggested in the law itself. Organizations can use their own consent management mechanisms as well. Now, this is also applicable to them if you interpret it that way. This BRD is also mentioning that what are the expectations from consent management function as such. So all these requirements, and whatever features we talk about, consent-free, auditable, specific, unambiguous. So all this has to be catered. So we can't, and if it is not catering to this, it is invalid. Second aspect is also very interestingly, we have said that ease of giving consent should be, and ease of withdrawal should be same. So again, a lot of re-engineering would involve in this process. One is, if you look at from organization's perspective, some may go for their own consent manager. Some others may build API or integration with the consent management platform, which government or law has suggested. So there could be multiple strategies. It's also play the economy of scale, and also if you look at what Vijay was talking about, if you learn from banking or financial in the financial industry, can you I look at consumer platforms, can you outsource this function to that, at least that part of it, and you just focus on your core services, core businesses. If I'm a e-commerce, I should focus on my integrating my business buyers and sellers on my platform. The consent management can be outside the platform. It also gives me liberty to focus on my core business and outsource all this. And if there is economy of scale, then definitely helps me as well. So that's what I can comprehend from the BRD perspective, and that's where I think we are heading to as well.
Yeah, I guess, and maybe I'll continue with you, Prasad. Is like I said, this was very heavy on the consent full life cycle bit. But would you think that there are other pieces such as how do you deal with third parties and managing them, or perhaps breach and handling breach, which is technically at least the census is probably required to be ready, but necessarily not covered in this. So any thoughts on that front?
So obviously, third party worldwide is a big area of concern when it comes to data protection. What roles they are playing. So third party doesn't always mean that you're a data processor. You might have a joint data fiduciary or joint data controller, as we say. So what is the applicability of that in a particular process? And especially today, we are moving towards a platform age. So multiple players come, they contribute, they also do data processing, and then their roles. They might have their own purpose and means. And now when data is shared across these multiple stakeholders, because the boundaries are blurring today, then cross-border laws will come into picture. Then obviously, how do you audit your third parties? Now, a lot of people ask me, where are we? What should we start? We have not received the rules yet, but look at a third-party management. Have you reviewed the contracts with the third parties, right? Our law is again heavily focusing on data fiduciary, and there is no direct obligation on data processor, but then you have to put the contractual obligation. So to third parties perspective, that is another angle you should explore beyond consent manager. Third parties weak, then cross-border data transfer. We may come up with a negative list, but as of now, it looks like there is no specific restriction. So these are certain aspects of beyond consent management, I think. But I think framework addressing the now if you look at with consent focus and third parties, there will be a section, especially intermediaries, taking consent. Well, they have, for example, payment gateways. They may do fraud analytics. They offer us discounts, etc. And sometimes when you're doing a transaction, the visibility is minimum. So they don't reach out to us directly, but today they may have to take consent from us, right, as individuals. So that piece, and then how do they communicate their intent through the notice? Is every merchant covering that or not? So that is a big piece, I think, when you look at third parties and other aspects. So intermediaries would definitely have a challenge in how do they take consent if they are becoming a data fiduciary in the process.
Correct. So my takeaway is, yes, this is quite deep and exhaustive on the consent and consent lifecycle side, but there are perhaps other parts you need as well around, how do you manage third parties, breach, etc. That probably is required for a full scale sort of
Right. So what would
transformation.
have helped is there are other instruments in GDPR, like legitimate interest that could have helped, or performance of a contract. But we don't have those instruments here currently. We are very consent heavy.
Correct. Yeah. So maybe Sreenidhi, I'll switch over to you now. I think you've been quite active in obviously with your own clients, but also as we understand, you've been doing city-wise workshops, sort of run role plays on handling breach, for example, and things of that sort, right? Conducted mock simulations around this. And therefore, again, maybe linking back to the question I asked Prasad, is this set of guidelines are very heavy on consent, but I assume there are many other parts to this puzzle, right? So how do you view that? If I truly want to be compliant and, like I said, not just compliant, but over time extract value, what are the other parts of this puzzle one would need?
Yeah. No, definitely. I think these guidelines focus on one aspect, which is just consent, but there's a lot more to do at an org level as well. So usually I like to think of this in three buckets. The first is the front end with the, how to operationalize DPDP Act and rules and strengthen your data practices in three buckets. The first is the front end, which is user facing, which is reviewing your UI UX, reviewing your privacy notices, what is the form in which you're taking consent, which is what this document also focuses on. But again, it's not exhaustive. At the end of the day, each business has to draft its own privacy notice and map its purpose and consent and map its data with the purposes and different activities. And draft those, but that's the front facing UI UX piece, which is relevant for all B2C platforms, but even for other organizations. Even if you have just a website and there is some input of data that's happening there, then reviewing that touch point as to what it's looking like. There may be your own consent management system, or you integrate a third party, but eventually as the data fiduciary, you do that review. The second is what Prasad also mentioned, which is your third parties, managing your third parties that you're either your vendors, but not just your vendors. They could be business partners, they could be either joint data fiduciaries, or they could be independent data fiduciaries, where there is some collection of user data, or there's some transfer, receipt, sharing of personal data, but each of your third parties, the other party is also controlling the data in its own right. So very important to revisit those agreements, those arrangements, and evaluate roles, responsibilities, what are the kind of obligations. If it's a vendor that you're onboarding, then due diligence checks, what are their processes for incident response, and including all of these in the contract, seeking relevant reps and warranties from them. So making sure that you're being able to comply with what the law says and protecting your having strong indemnities in place. So that's the second bucket of third parties and arrangements. And this could be revisiting contractual arrangements, revisiting your processes for onboarding partners and vendors. And the third is the back end, which is really getting your house in order. It's creating your data inventories. It's looking at whether you have the right people in charge, your grievance officers, or DPO, or some large organizations may have privacy steering committees, but really taking that call as to what you need at an organizational level. What are your protocols for breach response? So we ran a few of these simulations across many cities, and which were really geared towards what do you do in a crisis situation. So having those playbooks in place, because when something happens, you don't want there to be a mad scramble of there's nothing really. What do we do? Protocols for responding to data principles, access rights. So whole that entire bucket. So these are the three broad categories, and every action that one must take will fall within one of the other. And just from all of the workshops, all of the client advice that we're also doing, I think there's still a long way to go. There is a large mix of organizations. Some are, of course, early adopters who started the journey early. But at the other end, like Vijay was mentioning, a lot of people are still waiting for some clarity here. In some cases, there's just inertia as well, or you don't know where to start or which of these buckets to even pick up. So but I think there's a bunch of things to do, and a lot of organizations are at different stages of the journey that they've, as far as data is concerned.
Yeah. No, thank you. I think you laid it out very nicely to say, obviously, there's a part around consent, which these guidelines cover. It's probably third party, there's breach, there is sort of, reporting. There are a bunch of other parts of this puzzle, right? That I think you very, very nicely explained, Sreenidhi. So I think and I think Prasad alluded to that as well, having sort of, let's say, established that, maybe I'll come back to you again, Prasad, and maybe after that to you, Vijay, is Prasad. So, I think assuming these guidelines are what they are, I think clearly it is very or reasonably different from any global sort of copy paste, right? It is in the context of India's own sort of specific rules. I think you alluded to some very specific things that are really only in the Indian context, Indian users, Indian systems. So does that mean that, in some sense, any global one size all fit solutions may or may not sort of fit here? And rather, through this initiative, it was also, as Sreenidhi pointed out at the start, this was meant as a NEGD sort of startup and innovation challenge. That is the idea also then we need things and solutions that are native to India and built for sort of our purpose and our context.
So yes, absolutely. In fact, rather any data protection regime, be it any country, I think there are a few things they will always consider is their national interest, this state of their economy, their relationship with other countries, geopolitical trade, okay, their socioeconomic realities, their culture, their history, how they evolved to the current state. If you look at all these aspects, even the state of, for example, state of digitization. Today, we are in a state of digitization where, most of us are using digital public infrastructure. We are consuming digital services like we have never done before. So since 2012, when the Jan Dhan Aadhaar mobile came into picture, JAM, MeitY white paper, we can see the movement towards digitization. So there is heavy thrust, and there is some sort of always a asymmetry between an individual and the organization processing in data. And that's where more the data protection. Secondly, data is also valuable now, and people call it as oil or the oxygen. And these days they call it oxygen as well. So countries are being protective about their data, and in India, especially looking at the scale at which we are operating, we are generating huge data. And obviously today AI is looking at data. So it's right time, rather we could have done it before as well, to get into the data protection region. And yes, I think the way it is drafted, it is taking into consideration our realities, our infrastructure, also our digital literacy, and that's why you see some linguistic requirements as well. And also taking care, using consent as a major instrument is also could be one of the rationale that people are aware and they're taking clear affirmative action to give that consent. So yes, I think there is definitely a kind of a deviation from what global norms are, but looking at our own realities and our own state of affairs, it is required probably. But in India, you look at every different country has a different way of looking at. So GDPR is very granular. They talk about cookies. Even the UI AI Act is 400 pages. I go into all the details. If you look at US, they don't have a federal law for privacy. They have mostly sectoral laws or the problem solution approach kind. So India is pretty much balanced in that way, not making it too strict, and at the same time taking care of startups, SMEs, and coming up with such suggestions like consent manager. I think fairly balanced that way.
Got it. And therefore, I guess, the objective of these guidelines as well was to almost, I guess, create something in India for India and to cater to the needs of this.
The vocabulary uses data fiduciary. Fiduciary is someone you trust, and data principle is not a data subject. Data principle is our own term, giving the importance of principle. So that way, it's very Indian way or Asian way of looking at things.
No, I think great. That was a very pertinent thought. And that not struck me, but I think in the way you just described it, very, very apt. So Vijay, maybe I'll turn to you.
Yeah.
And I think we've gone through this in this conversation. We've looked at what these guidelines are, or as it's called BRDR. What part of the puzzle does it really complete? I guess Vijay talked about the fact that objective also is to create for India, by India sort of solutions. So I think in with your customers, right, as they are thinking through how they're going to, I think one is maybe if you could describe where they are in the thought process, which I think you partly did, but any more color would help. Yeah. And secondly, there's always this question. I think Sreenidhi and Prasad, both you mentioned, you could obviously get this from a third party with sort of economies of scale, etc., and focus on your core business, or you could sort of develop this themselves, irrespective, I guess, that these guidelines provide at least some basic framework to work with. But what are you seeing, right? I think in terms of build versus buy and what's driving that choice. And I think then the kind of related question is, and therefore in that context, does cloud, etc., is important, and how are you kind of having these conversations?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question, Malcolm, and I think that's something that when we talk to customers, some of these thoughts, we hear from them. Some of them, we help refine. Some of them we help channelize in terms of in a certain direction. But broadly, right, if you see, I think some key parameters, I would say, are important when they are trying to think of, hey, how much do I do this in-house vis-a-vis how much do I engage third-party platforms, right? I think the first thing is the time to comply, right? So everyone's kind of aware that once this starts, there will be a certain time frame in which one has to meet it. So then am I better off taking a platform, right? Possibly. I think it will enable a faster go live. Okay. The other thing is that how flexible will be the platform in terms of integration, right? Like, so typically we have seen that larger banks, and I know that there is an AWS customer, a large customer, which you all have kind of broken into the so it's one of the top 3 banks in the country, where they've going and implementing this full-fledged, right? And one of the things that they've always wanted is in terms of modular API first components, right? So that they can do this. I think a very important aspect is that there is a cost of the talent and maintenance. Okay, so I think building and maintaining these requires a certain level of talent, and also being able to stay on ahead of the curve, which like it depends on whether banks consider that as core and keep wanting to do that, or trust in a platform which is, I mean, that's their core business of the platform, and they're also certified by multiple bodies, etc. I think those parameters keep coming up, right, when we discuss. So so if I were to just kind of distill it down, I think it's really time to comply. How modular is the stack? Like, is it like a really composable architecture that we can build or we can buy? Right? What is the cost of investing in those resources and technology, and not only investing once, but making sure that all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed continuously, right? That becomes an ongoing, challenge, and which is where we really feel that with cloud and, let's say, platforms coming together, that's really an approach that we are also urging our customers to go with, because it's like we are already dealing with quite a few unknowns here. Having a platform full-fledged into this, who are trying to kind of build end-to-end solutions, will really make the lives of customers easier, and that's really been our point of view to our customers as well.
No, I think very, very practical advice, Vijay. Thank you for that. I think we're getting to the point of the last couple of questions, and we'll then open it up. But Sreenidhi, I'll bring you in, and I think we alluded to you to it earlier. You're working with your clients in various capacities, some assessments. Some people have perhaps moved to implementation. Some are probably somewhere in between. But what are you finding as some of the key challenges that people are grappling with? Right? Is it around UX? Is it around consent fatigue? Is it around perhaps on the internal side, aligning stakeholders? Is it around actually discovering where my data lies, right? So and again, I mean, this at least some of the things we heard, but would love to get your thoughts. Where do you think are some of the challenges and balances and trade-offs coming in as you see it?
Sure. Yeah, so maybe I'll start with what I'd already said, which is, I think the first sort of big challenge often is some level of inertia, there not being enough buy-in within the organization, sometimes at the top, but often also across different teams and functions. So even if you get the project, get the process sort of started, really getting that kind of buy-in, getting some deeper engagement, the right kind of responses, that does take a while, and also perhaps compounded by the fact that we're still waiting for the rules. There's not, the DPB is not in place yet. The act is sort of not in force yet, so isn't that much the risk of a direct penalty just yet. So I think just the people piece, which is some hesitation in just getting the ball rolling, and even in a lot of the data discovery, data mapping exercises, sometimes not getting the right kind of responses or getting really high level responses. And often there also sometimes I sense some hesitation just because it's not something that we've been used to for a long time. Data was being managed centrally, it was being used fairly aggressively. So I think just that kind of mindset and organizational process shift. Then I think in terms of for a lot of other organizations, especially the ones that are really consumer facing, not so much B2B, but where you're actively engaging with customers and getting their data. I think not enough detailing perhaps in the purposes. And for a long time, market practice had been a catch-all kitchen sink consent, where one only adds a link to the privacy policy and gets a user's consent to that. But really the law stepped in and said consent has to be tied to purpose, and that's what this document is also hinting towards: more unbundling of consent, that you have to have more granular purposes. But I can understand why that's a tricky exercise for a lot of businesses. Business teams do find that challenging. There is a risk of real user drop off, and in some instances a lot of the purposes are so incidental and kind of critical to the main purpose, like network security, preventing fraud, platform security, or all sort of incidental purposes baked into the core purpose of service delivery. So I don't think the idea with the law, or even this document, is that you have 10 different checkboxes, but I understand from product teams even adding one statement, there is some friction there. So one does have to weigh those risks, make some careful design choices on how one wants to present consent in a way that is meaningful, in a way that's delivering the right kind of information to the user, and getting their consent to these themes. So I think at the org level, there's some inertia. Then there are these individual pieces that we come to.
Got it. No, thank you, Sreenidhi. And I'm sure the list is longer than that, but I think those are perhaps the top few. And thanks for sharing that. I think the last question, which I'm going to actually do a round robin, but we'll start with Prasad, and then I'll quickly get comments on the same thing from you, Vijay and Sreenidhi, in that order. And then we'll get to audience questions. Is probably the most open question of this conversation is, as you said, we're waiting for the rules, and obviously there are people who begun to move. There's people who are saying, "Hey, I'll move only after the rules come," and there's everything in between, right? So, Prasad, I'm going to give you the difficult one to say, for those, in the wait and watch mode. Obviously, there are some who are moving, right, which is great, I guess. But for those in the wait and watch mode, or the people who are sort of perhaps saying, "Should I act now? Should I act later? Or I'll wait?" What is your advice to them, right? Or maybe if I could add on, what would you advise to people between now and whenever the rules come out, right? And it's, I guess, anybody's guess, but what would you suggest they do? And then, Prasad, once you're done, it would be good to get the same view from Vijay, yourself, and Sreenidhi. And then we'll move to audience questions.
So if you look at certain aspects, right, you will have to do no matter what. Now, if you have the law, you have the rules as well. Then now you look at the rules, you get a fair understanding. There can't be something which will override the law, right? So in rules also, for example, notice, it's very clearly given what should be part of the content of the notice. I think majority of the decisions you want to go for the implementations, we can see that already in the law. In fact, you should have started your data discovery exercise, data classification exercise. You should start your data protection impact assessments. You should set up your privacy organization. That is very important. You should start creating that awareness across levels, not just people in privacy security function, but across board of directors, your business unit heads, your developers, your business analyst, your IT infrastructure team. They should sensitize them, and that doesn't require the law to be commenced. You should look at your data as well. What kind of data you have, how authentic it is. Look at data lineage. Where have you gathered this data from? Are you able to reach your current individuals whose data you're processing? Because you have to send notice in retrospective manner, right? What would be those mechanism? I don't think these things require a lot of what Sreenidhi talked about. Data breach. You don't need to build a playbook later. You can work on it. You have already some experience in BCPDR or security incidents. You can leverage that. You can start your data protection impact assessment. You've done risk assessment in security. Similar exercise. Only what is the impact you're inflicting on individuals. That's the focus area here. So these things you can always start. There might be certain things like whether I'm a SDF or a DF, but trust me, the penalties are same, right? Whether you're SDF or DF. So don't wait for these decisions to come or these notifications to come, you start your journey. That's what I would advise. Looking at the size of your organization, even if you want to appoint a data protection officer, not necessarily it has to be a dedicated responsibility. It could be shared responsibility. So you take these calls and you get started with your journey, at least understand your footprint. Your contract management is a big piece. How your third parties are reacting to it. Are you in a safe hands with third parties? Do they have appetite to deal with this kind of penalties? Or are you carrying huge risk with such third parties? That posture management also you can judge now, and it is, and you good bandwidth today to do those things rather than wait for the rules to come and the law to be enforced and then worry whether the timeline is good enough or not.
Yeah, no, I think that's a pretty clear to-do list, Prasad. But Vijay, Sreenidhi would love for you to add your thoughts very quickly to that.
Sure, Malcolm. See, I think what is really happening is that, well, a lot of financial institutions are cautiously proactive, if I may put it that way. Clearly, because I think the full execution, is awaiting complete regulatory clarity. I think it is very important to invest to really invest in some foundational capabilities, right? First being consent management. I think that's super important and already recognized, and so on. Second is in terms of immutability. I think immutable logging is something that people understand is critical to capabilities as and when it pans out. Customer transparency. I think to be able to help the customer end to end in terms of being transparent about what is being gathered and what is being used for. And last, in terms of, I think, vendor readiness, right? So I think it's important to invest in these capabilities and not continue to wait. I think that would be my first takeaway to the audience in terms of practitioners and so on. It's important to get going. The second takeaway, which I would really say, is that in this journey, right, don't look to go it alone, right? Look at platform providers, players who have built up their expertise in this space, right? People who are willing to provide these offerings, right? Because sometimes in the when in a build mode, we tend to underestimate the legal aspects, the depth which is needed, the technology aspects, all of that. So please work with a partner is what I would say. It will also help you in terms of faster time to comply, right? And more importantly, I think as and when the act evolves and newer things come, right, it'll help you be on top of things, right? So I think that would really be my second takeaway. One is get started if you're not already. Second is please evaluate how you can work closely with platforms so that you have a faster go to market on this. That's really my two things.
Sreenidhi, your addition, please.
Yeah, I think I'd be echoing a lot of Prasad and what Vijay have said, but yeah, I think the first would be just start now. Lots to be done, lots of different pieces, moving pieces, but at least some start is better than waiting for the rules to come, because like Prasad said, a lot is already in place in the act. And we also have a draft version of the rules that signals what the government's thinking might be on a lot of these aspects. So there isn't that much to wait for, really. The next theme would be just organizational culture, sensitization, awareness, create some kind of privacy champion, someone in the organization, and not just the folks who'd be steering it, like Prasad had said again, but across departments, across functions, identify folks who can work with you on this. Third-party management, again, very critical, because it's kind of external exposure there, ring fence it through the right contractual protections. Even if you're not opening up your past contracts, at least have a plan in place for future vendors whenever you're onboarding someone, and look at your vendor onboarding processes. And I think just even if one is not able to, for whatever reasons at this stage, do a full-fledged gap assessment, I'd say at least start with one or two critical functions, identify those priority functions, and start implementing, just discovering the data, the gap assessments with those. Let's say it could be whoever's managing your CRM or marketing campaigns, or I don't know, just even employee data, if it is actually a enterprise which isn't so much B2C facing. So I think identify those priority functions or teams and tackle those. Yeah, I think those would be my some takeaways.
Wonderful. I think we've got 10 minutes and maybe we'll extend for 5 or 10 minutes, perhaps more, and take audience questions. But thank you for all three of you for sharing your thoughts. I'm going to request Nikhil to perhaps just, I mean, there are a lot of questions and some of them will absolutely respond to, but we'll perhaps pick up 3 or 4 in the next 10-15 minutes and get responses to them. So Nikhil, over to you, and you can direct it to, you can curate them and direct it to whoever you think appropriate.
Sure. Thanks, Malcolm. I think there's a few which are very tricky. I think the first one is always when is the implementation timeline and when is it coming? And if there was $1 for every time somebody asked somebody a question, I think we'd all be very, very rich. But yeah, so we'll skip that one. I think there is one which is very pertinent to our discussion today, and maybe I'll direct it to either Prasad or Sreenidhi. There is a question that fundamentally talks about what is this difference between a consent manager and what the BRD calls a consent management system, right? So I think if either of you could just take that to just clarify what these two entities are and how are they different, and if they were to work together, what would it look like? That will be very useful.
This question is for?
Sir, either of you, Prasad, maybe you
Okay.
can start. Yeah.
Consent manager, and see, consent manager, please don't go by this. Some organizations reached out to me saying that, is it a person? They were floating job descriptions. So it's just typically an organization which will set up this consent management system. So BRE talks about consent management system. So it's a system which some organization will put, and there are a lot of rules about that organization as well. What should be their financial net worth? What should be the profile of their board of directors or senior leadership in that organization? Code of conduct, and what the organization should not sell themselves or merge themselves without approval of the board, data protection board. So all this is there is an organization. Obviously, there's a behind this platform which will come up. There should be no conflict of interest. So consent manager is something, that's what the law, when it suggests we should have a consent manager, and then the consent management system is system which will deliver this consent management functionality. Okay. Now you may have your own in-house consent manager that you can operate and continue to do that. You currently probably collecting consent, acquiring consent to current consent management system that can continue. But this is what they've suggested is a platform that can come and giving choice to individuals to opt out for that platform. The platform may collect consent from multiple organizations, multiple stakeholders, multiple companies, multiple data fiduciaries. They manage the consent management lifecycle on that platform, and that platform will be obviously be built by and operated by any organization or enterprise. And there are certain rules who should be that enterprise. There will be the net worth, as I said. And there should be no conflict of interest. So these are the, I hope you get broadly what it is. Sreenidhi, over to you if you want to add anything.
No, that was just what I was going to say. Not consent manager is not an officer like the DPO or a grievance officer. It is an organization which could be third party, and like Prasad said, there are all of these registration requirements and net worth and all of those requirements that one had, which the rules will also further detail, which one would have to abide by to be a consent manager.
Yeah, and maybe if I would add, Nikhil, I think the consent manager, as Prasad said, is somebody who centralizes all of this, makes life easy for the customer, and probably talks to multiple fiduciaries. The consent management system is something fiduciaries use to comply, manage, automate the internal process workflow, which could be, inbuilt or provided by a third party, right? So I think two kind of very different things.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you.
That's good.
Yeah. There's another interesting. I think this is, again, I think it'll be interesting to hear opinions across the board, maybe all three, whoever would like to pick this. There's a question from Niranjana, and she talks about how do we implement consent and privacy notices without compromising user experience, right? Since this is like we discussed before, it's a departure from a single checkbox to what we understand a privacy notice to be. So how should organizations be thinking about almost deconstructing from a single privacy policy to privacy notices that may be sort of just in time, and what are some best practices that you've seen? So open question to anybody who would like to pick it. Yeah.
See, we are going to go through notice fatigue and consent fatigue as individuals. Since our law is consent heavy and they're saying that notice should be sent retrospectively, we'll get notice fatigue, and this will happen, continue to happen. And look at the kind of definition of consent it is. It's specific consent, should be clear, affirmative, unambiguous. So it is not an easy to build user experience in this. What globally we have seen is, if your intent is good, you will try to make it to say itemized way, collapse buttons so that people can read it to go to the sections they want. There's also another very interesting way that is now becoming popular is put videos, animated videos also, what does it mean giving consent? So try to explain it to people who not necessarily familiar with this typical legal language. Try to keep it simple, plain. There are tools now that are also trying to evaluate whether your notice is easy to read. What is the kind of index, put index of ease of reading, ease of accessing, all these things will come. It's already, there are a lot of research happening in this area. So yes, but what is more important is, see, and I think we should mention this in this call, is we are talking about purpose. Now, simple thing, I say that I am doing a customer profiling. Now, customer profiling, what does it actually mean? It may mean something for company A, something for company B, company C. So in my opinion, as we evolve, there will be a dictionary of purposes, common vocabulary. To begin with, it may be very sector specific. Banking sector, custom profiling means this. And we will get used to it as individuals as we go through this journey, but somewhere that effort will happen. In fact, tools will also help us. Consent management platform also will help us gather those tags, that vocabulary, and come up with a dictionary of purposes, which is common, so that there is no confusion in the minds of individual when profiling means what profiling means. Because you're taking consent for profiling, what it means is the three things. That should be very clear, and that definition should be agreed at least across sector, a particular sector, companies in a particular sector, and then we can see if it can be leveraged cross sector as well. So we hope you get some understanding from this
I think
response.
this is very useful. I believe this is answered well. In fact, I believe DSCI also has an asset. I think it's called Preview. What we'll try to do is also paste a link in the chat, and maybe sort of that sort of serves as a guidance in case people are still thinking what should their privacy notices look like. I'd urge Rebecca to maybe post the link on the chat.
Yeah. So DSCI and IDfy have together, if it is at no cost, you can access the URL, you can upload your existing notice, generate itemized notice, or you can generate it manually as well. So both options are available. Please try that. It is just to help the ecosystem generate the notice. It is a good notice generator that we have created, and this is free of cost. Thanks, Rebecca.
So I think I'll go on to, I think this is a slightly more generic question, but I'll try to color it with enterprise flavor. Somebody in the chat has asked, how do we build a privacy first culture in the organization? And I think where I sort of see this pain is while data protection officers and legal counsels, do care about data privacy, data protection, and think of it from a compliance lens, sometimes it doesn't percolate well into the other leadership in the organization. So Vijay, maybe from your experience, are there, really other benefits that one could derive from doing a privacy transformation? If at all, what would that look like? Because sometimes purely looking at it from a compliance lens becomes limiting. So anything that you've heard from your experience would be good for the audience to hear as well.
Yeah, sure. See, again, a lot of these soft aspects come here, right? When we talk about privacy and how important it is to the enterprise, right? And ultimately, any customer-focused enterprise has to take this seriously, right? Like, so there is no two things about it. So I think the first thing is, as always, a lot of these things have to come top down. Because it's still in a very nascent stage, right? Like, so you need to make it part of board agendas, CXO agendas, possibly even have a part of your mission statement linked to privacy, right? Because it has to align with companies' values and the customer promise, right? I think that is important. The other thing is to have an inclusive task force which goes at it, right? Like, it is not just one unit of the business which is responsible for this. If anything, it's a cross-functional unit comprising possibly legal, tech, HR, risk, security, product, marketing. I think everyone comes together, right? And that is super important when it comes to drafting these policies, defining some of the guardrails, right? All of that stuff, right? Like, so I think that is super important. And while people come together, I think a lot of individual roles are important, right? Like, so you have marketing roles where you need to train them, for example, specifically on, say, consent UX and so on. Developers, how do you imbibe privacy by design? That becomes important. Sales, for example, when they're dealing with customers, what is the basic hygiene they need to kind of follow? What are grievance processes they need to follow? If it's HR, then what about like employee data rights, right? I think all those are important. To me, I think the most important thing is how are you embedding privacy by design, right, into product and tech, right? So that is super critical, right? So I think combination of all of this, and at the end of the day, it has to be customer centric, right? Like, because you're really looking at making granular, contextual and possibly multilingual consent flows, right? So it has to really be customer centric, and all of this needs to come together, in a combined manner, when you're trying to drive this as a culture.
Yeah, I think should we do
Maybe
one more?
one last question, Nikhil, and then we'll wrap.
Yeah.
There's just one thing is, I think instead of
please.
calling it privacy first approach, you should call it privacy by design approach. That's a better way to go about it. You have to have a win-win situation when you're discussing with business. Do not deprive users and individuals of any functionality. So privacy should be by design, by default, and not just privacy first. Privacy first will lock horns with business. No, you have to be innovative and come up with innovative solutions for a win-win situation.
Yeah, and probably just on operationally, of course, aligned with everything that Vijay and Prasad said, but just one thing that's worked well in our experience is just case studies, simulations, these tabletop exercises and workshops, really based on what can go wrong and how wrong with dodgy data practices. I think that kind of instills some level of understanding of what really is expected, at least some basic level of hygiene to start with, just from a purely, operationally, how does one start?
So I think these are all useful points. Thank you, everyone, for chiming in. I think there's one last one that we could maybe cover. I think this we can answer offline. I think this is again a very sort of slightly older question. I would say keeps coming up time and time again. We do understand that there's legitimate use and then there's notice and seek consent. But oftentimes for employment purposes, right? I think there's a carve out for employment purpose, quote unquote. And I think sometimes it's unclear how long should you retain data, what are the kinds of activities, whether what sort of gets covered under employment purpose. So if somebody would like to pick this, maybe Sreenidhi. So there's a question here. I think the confusion is how does this tie into the rights of the employer-employee relationship from an employee contract perspective?
Yeah.
So maybe you'd like to cover that. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, so the law does have one legitimate use for employment purposes, which is to protect employers, whatever data you're processing in the ordinary course of the employer-employer relationship. But it's not a carte blanche either. I've often heard this, being debated on. Does that mean any and all data of employees can be collected under this legitimate use, and that's that? So I'd caution against that approach. I think even with employment, one should granularly map down your purposes and what you're exactly using the data for in that employer-employee construct. So if there is something which is basic kind of payroll processing, or something which is required for legal compliance, government identification, or some data that you need to safeguard the employer against any loss of, protecting from a confidentiality lens, that should be fair. But at the same time, if let's say there is a survey or a questionnaire that's being done for diversity, strictly whether it can be justified for a as an employment purpose. I think each purpose would have to be tracked and seen whether you can justify it in that employment purpose exception that's carved out. So I just express some caution against using this excessively, especially also, at the time of recruitment and post termination of employment. Of course, it would be fair to hold on to some of that data for legal purposes, for legal requirements, for compliance with the law, to be able to defend yourself in a claim subsequently. There is that allowance in the law, but periodically each data must still be mapped and tracked.
So one more important aspect here to
Yeah.
add to what Sreenidhi has already covered a lot of things, but please, there is a misconception that there is no consent. It's just exemption is for the consent. You have to give notice. Other things are mandatory. This is there's a lot of companies saying that we don't have to do anything about employee. Yeah, no, you have to give notice. You have to inform them what you're doing with the data. That obligation doesn't go away, right? You still are a data fiduciary from employee's perspective, and every organization for that matter, right? And secondly, why consent is not always a good instrument between employer and employee, because there's no equilibrium between them. So most of the time, employee will be giving consent because employer has access to a lot of things, and they can call their shots. So it's a weak instrument anyways. Take a consent from employees.
Yeah, no, I think my sort of submission and sort of realization is maybe for payroll processing, you don't need to take consent, but you might need to show notice to this individual if you're using his image on your website, for example, right? And that may or may not qualify as employment purpose, and that's sort of just my own sort of interpretation. But yeah, I think with that, I think
Yeah.
sort of Malcolm, over to you.
Yeah, no, I think we can have this discussion for the next few hours, right? This is that complex and interesting a topic, but I think please keep the questions coming. I think there is a contact ID, and we can post it in chat on. If you have other questions, we can just share a email ID, Rebecca, where folks can continue to sort of just ask and interact. I think we promise that we'll get you answers and get back to you. But with that, I think we'll wrap up. And I just want to say thank you again to Prasad, Vijay, and Sreenidhi. We brought very different sort of perspectives. I think we timed this in a way, given there was a lot of debate around these guidelines and BRD and different words being used. So I think thank you first of all for clarifying what they are and what they are not. Thank you also for sharing that this is one part of the puzzle, as Prasad, Sreenidhi, you laid out, but there are other parts of the puzzle. And I think at the end, thank you for talking about what you need to do between now and whenever the rules come out, right? And I think the message was very clear: don't sit still. There's a lot to do once they come out for sure, but there's a lot to do right now itself. And thanks for reiterating that. So it was a pleasure talking to all of you, and at least I kind of enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for being open and forthright, and I'm sure the audience as well. So really appreciate your time, and thank you again.
I think thanks to Malcolm and the Privy team for putting this together. I think this has been a great session, and I'm sure a lot of the attendees found value in it. Thanks also Prasad and Sreenidhi. It was wonderful chatting up with both of you on this.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks all. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.